So today we're taking another look at aftermarket brake pads, but this time we're taking a look at parts store brake pads. Are there really any differences between parts store brake pads and the aftermarket brake pads that we took a look at in the prior video to this one? In regards to that prior video, guys, I will put a card up in the corner to that if you guys want to check out the first video in this series, where I went out and I purchased, I think, like 12 different brake pads, installed all the brake pads on the same car, and tried to see, is there really any difference between like a super high-end pad and a super low-end pad they're all marketed as a factory replacement brake pad. So in this video, what we're going to take a look at is I've got 3 different pads here from O'Reilly Auto Parts. I've got 4 different pads here from Advance Auto Parts. I've got 3 different pads here from AutoZone, and finally I have 3 different pads from NAPA. In the United States, those are kind of the big 4 auto part retailers. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how the heck all these different part store brake pads compare to one another. Now, as far as the test procedures for each one of the pads in this video, guys, the test procedures that I'm going to use here are the exact same test procedures that I used in the first video in this series. And the reason for that is, well, what that's going to allow you guys to do is then you can make direct A/B comparisons between 2 different pads that appear in 2 separate videos. So like, let's say, for example, you want to know how the Wagner QS compares to an off-the-shelf AutoZone pad. Well, they're going to be tested the exact same way. So if you're interested in one of those 2 pads, depending on the video that you're watching, you can find out the information that you're ultimately looking for. So with all that in mind, guys, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on the car in case you guys haven't seen the first video in this series. And then we're going to go over to the bench and we're going to start looking at each one of the pads and show you what they include and, unfortunately, what they don't include when they come from a parts store. So the vehicle that I'm going to be using for testing is my 2014 Chevy Cruze with the 1.4 liter turbo engine in it. It has the smaller of the 2 factory GM brake options. It has, I believe it's like a 10.8 inch disc in the front, and it has drums out back. As far as modifications to the vehicle, the only thing that I have done to the vehicle is I have wired the driver's side front brake caliper with a pressure sensor. So you can see that stainless steel fitting runs up into the engine compartment, and in the engine compartment you have this sensor here. That sensor runs over to that wiring, goes to a Banks module that then runs inside the car, which goes to a Banks iDash. So if I turn this thing on and flip my page over, and when I step on the brake, you can see brake pressure is registered on this iDash. So what this iDash is going to allow me to do is I'm going to data log every single stop that I make with each one of these pads in this video. I'm going to then analyze all of the data and then get you guys the overall performance of each pad. I've got all of the pads laid out here on the bench. We're going to kind of go through each store one at a time just to show you what the different tiers of pads include from each retailer. So the first one we're going to start out with here is going to be O'Reilly's. The low tier O'Reilly pads, the standard Brake Best pads, do not include any sort of hardware. This is very, very common throughout all of these retailers, that the low tier pads from each one of the retailers do not include any type of hardware. When you go up to the mid-tier pad, they then include the hardware. Finally, the highest tier pad from O'Reilly's, it has a piece of painted hardware, which frankly doesn't make much sense to me, because why would you want to paint a piece of non-corrosive stainless steel? But at any rate, I guess it's something for them to talk about on the box. And the pads themselves have a blue break-in coating on them. Moving over to Advance Auto Parts, I've got 2 different low tier pads here from Advance Auto Parts, and we'll talk about why here in a few minutes. But as you can see here, this low tier pad from Advance doesn't even have the gas slot in it. There's a few pads on this workbench that don't even have a gas slot, which the factory pads do in fact have a gas slot. So it should have a gas slot. Again, like I said, there's no hardware with the low tier when you go up to what they call their gold tier or their mid-tier line, they then throw in the hardware and it has the proper gas slot like it's supposed to. Finally, their platinum line. Their platinum line has the nicest hardware, honestly, out of anything on the bench. I'm not sure if you guys will be able to hear this, but this is a piece of rubberized hardware. So the back side of this hardware actually has a rubberized coating on it and the front side is painted. Not that the paint actually matters at all, but this is the nicest piece of hardware out of anything, you know, in any of these kits. The pads themselves do have a break-in coating on them, but again, there is no gas slot in this highest grade pad from Advance Auto Parts. So will that affect anything? We'll have to see. Next, moving over to AutoZone. The AutoZone low tier pads, again, simply give you the pads, no hardware, no grease, no nothing, just a set of pads. When you move up to the mid tier, you get the hardware and the pads. Again, no gas slot in the mid-tier AutoZone pads for whatever reason. Finally, the Duralast Elite from AutoZone. This is the only one on the bench that actually includes grease, the hardware, and the pads. This, to me, is the most complete kit here. And this is actually what you get in most branded aftermarket pad kits. Is most aftermarket kits will give you the hardware and the grease at a much cheaper price point than what these Duralast Elites are. But at any rate, we'll have to see how they perform. Finally, moving over to NAPA. Their lowest tier is going to be called Stop Right. Simply gives you the pads like the rest of these. Their mid tier is going to be their Proformer. They give you the hardware, but there's no gas slot in the pad. And then finally, their Silent Guard is the hardware, a break-in coating on the pad, but no grease. So hopefully that gives you guys some sort of idea of what's actually included in all of these different pad kits. Now, as far as the overall construction of each one of these pads, there really isn't much to say. If you're buying a set of pads from a parts store, you can pretty much guarantee they're gonna have the right amount of friction material. The backing plate's gonna be the correct thickness. But unfortunately, there is one exception to the rule. Now, this is, I'm sure, application specific. You know, this isn't a widespread issue at Advance Auto Parts, but it is worth noting because at this point, I have tested 25 pads, and this is the only pad that I have had any sort of fitment issue with so far. So this pad here is the low-end CarQuest pad from Advance Auto Parts. This low-end pad from Advance Auto Parts is actually slightly too narrow. So when you go to put it in the bracket, there is free play between the pad and the bracket, allowing the pad to move in the bracket. The rest of the pads here are perfectly fine, and I measured it, and that pad is roughly, I want to say it's around 15 thousandths smaller than what it should be. When you measure it against a known good, it's quite a bit smaller. So it is a tangible difference between this pad from Advance and this pad from Advance. They both came from the exact same place. And hopefully you can see that, you know, that's 10 to 15 thousandths worth of difference between these two pads. So as far as information regarding my testing, I took every one of the pads here and I installed the pad on this 2014 Chevy Cruze, and at the same time, I installed a brand new rotor with each pad that I'm testing here. So brand new pad, brand new rotor, and that is the results that we're gonna take a look at. Now, as you would imagine, when you do 25 brake jobs in the span of about 1,000 miles, well, the slide pins were well lubricated. Everything is functioning as far as the brakes are concerned. There's no other issues here. The only thing that I did not do as far as installing the new pads and rotors on the vehicle is I reused the same caliper bracket hardware for every pad here. And the reason for that is to save myself a little bit of labor because, well, caliper bracket hardware is not going to change your panic stopping distance. Caliper bracket hardware is not going to change the initial bite of a set of brake pads. Caliper bracket hardware is not going to change how much brake dust a set of pads produces. So at a certain point, it's just sort of irrelevant, and it was going to save me labor to just reuse that hardware. Now, once I got all of the pads installed, I also went through and I bedded in all of the pads before doing any sort of testing. So I bedded in the pads by doing what was it, 15 firm stops from 30 miles an hour. So consecutively, just one right after another. So I would run the car up 30 miles an hour, give it a firm brake application, get it right back down to about 5 miles an hour and re-accelerate to 30 and just do that 15 times over and over to put some heat in the brakes. And what that's gonna do is, first of all, burn off any residual oil that may be on the rotor, and it's gonna transfer some of the pad material from the pad into the rotor to get them, obviously bedded in correctly. Now, as far as bed in, there were a few pads, if you guys paid attention when I went over the pads themselves, there are a few pads here that have a break-in coating. Every pad here broke in perfectly fine, with the exception of one that was a little bit odd, the AutoZone pad. So let me show you the clip of my initial reaction when I bolted the AutoZone pads up to this car. So I just put the AutoZone pads, the highest end AutoZone pads on this Cruise, and listen to this. What the hell, man? Oh, these are brand new. I don't know, I'm still breaking them in, but I've been changing brake pads for 20 years, 25 years, since I was about 12 years old. I have never, ever, ever have had a set of brake pads sound like that when I put them on. They're getting better, but dude, the first couple of stops, yeah, they have some sort of break-in coating on them, and yeah, it's definitely a little odd. That's all I'm gonna say. We'll see how they perform. Now, the thing that I found very strange about that noise is the fact that every upper tier, like the super high tier pads that we're looking at here from O'Reilly, Advance, and NAPA, also have a break-in coating on them, and the ones from AutoZone were the only ones that had that sort of weird noise going on. So I'm not sure what went on there. At any rate, AutoZone didn't include any sort of bed-in information with these pads, so naturally I bedded the pads in the exact same way because, well, I didn't have any instructions telling me otherwise. So take that for what it is. It's very, very concerning when you bolt up a set of brakes and they make that kind of noise. You start questioning the work that you did and things like that, but ultimately they were fine once they got a few stops on them. Now, as far as the test loop that all of these pads were driven on, all of these pads were driven on the exact same test loop. That test loop was about 50 miles in total, and it featured, I believe, 12 stop signs, 4 traffic lights, and I did my panic stop testing on this test loop. I also did my initial bite testing on this test loop. So all of the results that we're gonna see here is different pads on the same roads with largely the same number of brake applications when we take a look at things like brake dust. So with all that in mind, well, first thing we're gonna take a look at here is panic stopping distance. So if you guys have seen the first video in this series, well, these two charts I have on the screen now should look very, very familiar to you. The chart on the top shows the panic stopping distance for each one of these pads. This is the average of 5 panic stops from 50 miles an hour measured in feet. So these are the results that I got. Now, if you look at the chart at the bottom, the chart on the bottom is showing the speed that I initiated the stops for the panic stops above. So because I have so much data off of this iDash, I'm able to precisely see the exact speed that the vehicle was going when I initially hit the brakes. I take the average of those 5 different speeds over the 5 panic stops, and those are the results that you're seeing at the bottom. So you can sort of apply a correction factor, if you will, to some of these outcomes based on the speed that I was going when I initiated the stops. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight as to, first of all, my overall variability, and then, is my variability causing any issues in the stopping distances above? As far as the overall results that you're seeing here, I think the big takeaway is if you draw a line between the NAPA Silent Guard and the NAPA Proformer, and you look at every pad to the left, every one of those pads to the left, 4 of the 7 that are to the left of the NAPA Proformer, those are the highest tier pads that you can get from these retailers. So it seemed like in the first video that I did, there really wasn't too much of a rhyme or reason as far as buying a quote unquote like higher grade set of pads really didn't seem to affect the stopping distance. But with these pads from a auto parts store, it does in fact seem to have some sort of benefit to the stopping distance overall. It's not much. I mean, as you can see here, the difference from the worst pad to the best pad is what, like 7 feet? In the first video, that difference from the worst pad to the best pad was 14 feet. And the other thing I noticed about this chart is if you take a look at the top 4 pads as far as this panic stopping distance, 3 of the 4 top pads here came from Advanced Auto Parts. It really didn't seem to matter whether you bought the low-end pad or the high-end pad from Advanced Auto Parts as far as panic stopping distance. And as long as you're buying the OEM friction material, meaning like this car came originally from the factory with ceramic, as long as you're buying a ceramic pad from Advanced Auto Parts, if the vehicle you're dealing with came with a ceramic, well, according to the data I have here, they're going to perform pretty well as far as a panic stop is concerned. So the blue bars are the exact same information as what you just saw, but the difference is the green bars on this chart are showing you the panic stopping distance with a set of cold brakes, and the gray bars are showing you the panic stopping distance with a set of hot brakes. So the average of the first 2 panic stops that I attempted are in green, and then the average of the last 2 with hot brakes are in gray. And you can see here, all these brakes are remarkably consistent. There really isn't a huge difference between a set of cold brakes and a set of hot brakes from what I tested here. I did look at one set of performance pads in the prior video, and there was a massive discrepancy between a set of cold brakes and a set of hot brakes. These parts store brake pads that I'm showing you here, these are very, very, very consistent with one another. And I think the biggest thing that you can notice here is probably going to be the NAPA pads right here in the middle. You know, the NAPA pads, they're all around 72 feet. It really doesn't seem like there's any tangible difference between the lowest tier NAPA pad and the highest tier NAPA pad. They're very, very, very similar to one another. They're probably the most consistent brake pads that I have found out of the 25 that I've tested so far. So if you were curious as far as how well these parts store brake pads compare to the rest of the ones I've tested so far, well, this is the overall ranking from both tests. There's 25 pads on here, and you can pause it and take a look at how they compare with one another. Now, this chart is probably one of the most interesting things that I found in this test. So what this is showing you the average ABS activation pressure over the 5 panic stops from the charts that I just showed you a few seconds ago. So on average, the Brake Best Select, which had the shortest stopping distance, had an average ABS activation pressure of 1,581 PSI. So as you look at this chart, you can plainly see there's a lot of these different pads here are between 1,200 and 1,500 PSI is when the ABS turns on in this vehicle. And it's like clockwork. At this point, I've tested 25 different brake pads, and I can assure you that with this Chevy Cruze, with this Nexen tire on it, on dry pavement, on this particular section of pavement, it will turn on the ABS between 12 and 1,500 PSI. It is remarkably consistent. The reason that I bring this up is if you look at the 2 outliers in this test, this CarQuest base with the asterisk and the Brake Best base, those 2 are 1,800 and the other one's 2,000 PSI. So what the heck is going on here? Well, these 2 pads are not ceramic pads. These are the first 2 pads that I have tested so far that haven't been a ceramic pad. Metallic and organic pads are very, very hard to find for this particular application. And looking at this information, it's pretty clear that moving from a ceramic pad to a organic or metallic actually is not a good thing for panic stopping distance or the overall performance of this braking system. So I think there's going to be a larger discussion here in a future video regarding ceramic, organic, and metallic pads, because you can plainly see, the ABS activation pressure with a non-standard friction material is way higher than what it should be. And like I said, all of these other pads here are between 12 and 1,500 PSI, like clockwork. Now, one thing I wanted to do for you guys is just show you visually how drastically different some of these pads are. And this data log that I have here on the screen, this is the GM OEM GM genuine brake pads that come on this car from the factory. So as delivered by GM, this is the brake pad that came on this car. And if you look here in a 50-mile-an-hour panic stop, it turns on the ABS between 12 and 1300 PSI. The reason that I know that the ABS is active in this portion of the data log is, well, when you look at where the vehicle is stopped, right here, you can see there the vehicle speed is 0. The brake pressure is 1400 PSI. So I'm applying 1400 PSI worth of pressure in this portion of the data log when the vehicle is stopped. But when the vehicle is in motion, the ABS system is bleeding off the pressure that I am inputting to help the tire maintain traction with the pavement, because the brake pad has more friction than the tire itself. So when you move over to the CarQuest pads, which have a metallic friction material, look at the difference in brake pressure. It's 2100 PSI here, and I'd be willing to bet the brake pressure in this section of the data log is probably actually higher than this. But the issue is the sensor that I installed on this car is only rated to 2000 PSI. So you can plainly see just how drastically different a ceramic pad on this car and a metallic pad on this car behave. And this is why you can't really trust those friction codes that are written on brake pads, you know, those letter code ratings that are on brake pads to show their coefficient of friction. When it comes to a panic stop, that data that they're giving you, that information, it's simply not relevant, and this is the proof. For those of you that maybe dispute, well, maybe the brakes are cold, you know, that is a fair assessment with a set of metallic brake pads. You know, if they're cold, they don't necessarily grip as well. So if you look at the data log here, this is number 106 right here in this corner. If I flip over here, the data log has changed to 111. So this is after the 5th panic stop, the pressure is the same. This is the 1st panic stop, and again, the pressure is the same. After the 5th panic stop, the rotor temperature here was over 400 degrees, which was about 75 to 100 degrees hotter than what it was with the GM genuine brake pads after 5 panic stops. So just know that there is going to be a much larger discussion here in the future regarding types of friction material, the overall friction codes, and how it actually affects how your vehicle behaves and how your vehicle stops. Because just because 2 pads have the same coefficient of friction according to the friction code doesn't mean they're going to stop the same at all. So like I was saying, more to come on the letter codes on the brake pads. The thing is about that, guys, both of those pads that we just took a look at in those 2 data logs, both of those pads were rated FF in that standardized friction coefficient testing. The issue is when you actually expose that pad and that friction material to reality in a panic stop, the parameters between those 2 situations are drastically different, and that is why you're seeing such a big difference in the ABS activation pressure. Like I said, more to come on that. I don't want to drag this video, completely off into the weeds, but it'll be a topic I explore in the somewhat near future. So the next thing we're going to take a look at here is going to be the initial bite and like the tip in. So one of the things that people really like about certain brands of brake pads is when you just lay your foot on the brake pedal, it'll drag that vehicle down from, whatever speed it's going very, very quickly with light pedal pressure. So what we're going to take a look at now is the exact same test that I did in the last video. So this is going to be from 25 miles an hour, applying the brakes at 350 PSI of caliper pressure. At what distance does it take the vehicle to stop at that very, very light pedal pressure like that? So starting out with the chart here on the top, these are the distances that it took this vehicle to stop with a largely fixed caliper pressure of around 350 PSI. And taking a look at the blue numbers that you see, that is initial bite with a set of cold rotors, and what you see in green is the initial bite with the same pads with a set of hot rotors. So you can plainly see, as some of these pads heated up, they did have a higher level of initial bite. But by and large, guys, there isn't huge differences here between these pads as far as initial bite is concerned. Overall, they all felt largely the same. underneath your foot. There really wasn't a huge outlier here. And when you look at the chart on the bottom, well, the chart on the bottom is the average caliper pressure over the 3 stops shown in blue. So when you look at my data logs, those are the averages. And again, you could maybe apply some level of a correction factor based on what you're seeing in that bottom chart into the information on the top chart. But by and large, all these pads feel shockingly similar, and it shows up in the data the exact same way. The only 2 real outliers here are going to be the CarQuest base kind of on that right-hand side, and then the BrakeBest base on the far right-hand side. So the CarQuest base, that is a metallic pad, and the BrakeBest base, that is an organic pad. And looking at the data that is presented here on the screen, you can kind of see, yeah, they are a little bit different as far as initial bite versus a ceramic, but by and large, there really aren't massive differences here. So before we get into the brake dust testing to see how much brake dust each one of these pads accumulated during that, test cycle that I ran, I do have one request from you guys. Is I'm looking to do one more video on brake pads using this 2014 Chevy Cruze. So what I'm gonna do is ask you guys for suggestions. So are there any brands that you want me to take a look at with this 2014 Chevy Cruze? And what you have to understand is whatever you suggest actually has to be available for a 2014 Chevy Cruze, and I have to be able to get my hands on it. So I know there's some European brands out there that I may or may not be able to get my hands on, but please suggest other brands down in the comments, and I can do one more round of this testing on this Cruze. It's really not that big of a deal. As far as performance brake pads, the performance brake pads that you guys have suggested so far, you guys have suggested obviously like EBC, Hawk, I saw Brembo on there, a few others, but the performance pads, I'm gonna use a different application because a 2014 Chevy Cruze is not gonna push a set of performance brake pads that hard. And basically, I'm just gonna get to a point where if I put a set of performance pads on this car, well, the tire is gonna be the limiting factor in that stopping distance. So at a certain point, you're gonna come up against the wall as far as how short the vehicle is gonna stop because the tire doesn't have enough traction with the pavement. So for performance brakes, I'm gonna have a separate video on that, probably late spring, early summer when it warms up a little bit, because I've got a car that can push a set of brake pads pretty hard compared to this thing. So look for those videos in the future, guys. Like I said, make some suggestions down in the comments, and I'll see what I can do about getting my hands on some more brakes. Any other brake testing that I'm gonna do isn't gonna be till spring. It's about November right now, and with snow and ice and stuff like that in northeastern Ohio, I gotta wait for the weather to break in the spring before I do any more brake testing. So with that, let me take you guys over to the bench here, and we're gonna take a look at how much brake dust all of these pads produced throughout all this testing we've looked at so far. So as far as brake dust testing, guys, you can see here just how strenuous some of this testing was. Like I can wipe some of this brake dust off. That amount of brake dust was accumulated over about 600 miles. So all of the brake dust from all of the testing looks like that on a set of wheels. But anyway, what I did to test this was I installed a piece of masking tape. You can see that section of the wheel right there is nice and clean. So after every set of pads, I would install a fresh piece of masking tape and clean that section of the wheel. And then after the testing was done, I would take that piece of tape and attach it to a piece of printer paper. So when you take a look at all the pieces of tape side by side, we have an idea of the overall brake dust performance. So I have these broken down by store. So this one here is going to be the O'Reilly store. This one is going to be the Advanced Auto Parts. This one is going to be the AutoZone. And finally, this one is going to be NAPA. As far as the overall worst one here, unfortunately, it's going to be the NAPA Silent Guard. For whatever reason, you can see it's quite apparent that there is much more brake dust on that NAPA Silent Guard than a lot of the other stuff here. But taking a look at each store individually, all these are arranged in order of lowest tier to the highest tier at the bottom. So they're all set up kind of the same way on each sheet. And for O'Reilly's, believe it or not, the worst one is going to be the BrakeBest Pro. Had the most amount of brake dust accumulated throughout that testing. I'll talk about this here in a second when we talk about AutoZone, but Moving over to Advanced Auto Parts, the metallic from Advanced Auto Parts, you can kind of see there, it's a little bit worse than a lot of the other stuff that you're gonna see from Advanced as you would expect when you move to a metallic. But honestly, you're splitting hairs. When you're looking at it, there's not much of a difference between most of the ones at Advanced at all. You can see the metallic up here at the top. Yeah, that is a little bit worse than some of the other stuff here. Moving over to AutoZone. AutoZone's gonna be kind of the same. Like, there isn't a whole lot of difference between what you're getting at AutoZone for brake dust as far as all the different tiers. And one of the things I kind of found that was a little bit unique is the AutoZone Elite pad and this Brake Best Pro pad. These come from the exact same manufacturer, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in the video. But looking at the two side by side, you can kind of see, yeah, the Brake Best Pro is a little bit worse than the AutoZone Elite for what it's worth. And then finally moving down to NAPA. Honestly, the two lower tier NAPAs aren't bad. The silent guards are pretty darn dusty for whatever reason. And what's really weird about this to me is you look at the overall performance that I got out of all of these pads from NAPA, and they were remarkably consistent as far as their stopping performance. But as far as brake dust is concerned, yeah, it's pretty apparent that the silent guards are a lot worse off than pretty much every other pad I have sitting here on the bench. So the final test that I ran on all these brake pads is going to be corrosion resistance. So in the back of my garage back here, just like the first video, I have the plastic storage tote running with the salt fog going. So if I open this tote, for those of you that haven't seen the first video, inside this Rubbermaid tote is all of the hardware. Underneath the hardware, I pull this off carefully. Underneath there are all the brake pads. So let me go over here and unplug this. So in the bottom of this storage tote, it's about 2 gallons of salt water. There's 2 Halloween misters, and I let this sit in here for just over a week. So these parts have about 172 hours on them. This is the exact same amount of time that the pads in the first test were in here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take all these pads, bring them over to the bench over there, lay them all out for you guys, and we're gonna go through each one of these pads one at a time just to show you the overall corrosion resistance of each one of these pads. So starting down here on the far left, we're gonna start out with the control pad for this test. So this is the GM genuine brake pad that comes on this car from the factory in a 5% salt solution over about 172 hours. So this is kind of the yardstick that all of these other pads are gonna be measured against because, well, this is what GM put on this car from the factory. So we're gonna start down here with O'Reilly's. The low tier O'Reilly pads seem okay. Not terrible. Moving up to their gold tier, they're about the same, honestly. There really isn't too much of a difference in corrosion resistance between the low tier and the mid tier O'Reilly pad. When you move up to the higher tier O'Reilly pad, it's actually quite a bit better than the OEM GM pad that came on this car from the factory. And there is a reason for that, and perhaps you can see that code there on the edge. We'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. So yeah, that's how that one compares. Looking at like the hardware and stuff, I've got the hardware up here too, guys. Again, same result as the last test. There really isn't any change in the hardware. And if you guys are looking for information regarding what part number pads I tested, well, all the part numbers are gonna be laid out here on the edges of the boxes. So hopefully that'll give you guys a plethora of information to decipher as I'm kind of going through here. So this low tier pad is the metallic from Advanced Auto Parts, and looking at the friction surface, yeah, it probably has a fair amount of metallic material in it, being that the friction surface is rusted really more than the backing plate is. Overall, honestly, they're not that bad as far as corrosion resistance is concerned, but what is a little bit strange here is moving up to the ceramic in the low tier pad. It's just as corroded on the friction surface as what the metallic pads are. So I'm not really sure what the formulation difference is between this ceramic pad and this metallic pad, but at any rate, the corrosion resistance of the friction material itself appears to be largely the same. There was differences in the overall stopping distance though. Next one here is going to be the gold tier from Advanced Auto Parts. Yep, that's honestly probably about even with the GM standard. You can see there is a little bit of rust jacking going on there. There is going to be some rust jacking in the future if it continues in this salt fog chamber right where that friction material meets the backing plate. Same deal with the hardware. Hardware is perfectly fine versus, you know, what came out of the package. The ultra high tier from Advanced Auto Parts, I really don't see any real difference between the super high tier from Advanced and the next tier down. So take that for what it is, guys, as you're looking at some of these results. I believe this one actually stopped shorter than the ultra high tier from Advanced. So honestly, the Advanced Auto Parts Gold is probably the pad you want to get from Advanced. Moving over to AutoZone. So the low tier AutoZone pad, again, very, very standard. It's remarkably consistent how similar all of these pads are in this testing. And looking at the AutoZone low tier, it's no exception. Moving up to the mid-tier AutoZone pad, the gold, there is more corrosion resistance on that mid-tier AutoZone pad than what there is on the low tier. So evidently it looks as though you are getting something for that extra money. And moving up to the highest tier AutoZone pad, this again, like the brake best down here on the end, is going to be very, very corrosion resistant. So looking at the overall condition of this pad after 172 hours, you can plainly see there is very, very little rust overall on that brake pad. So hardware between all these, again, is going to be the same. There's no change in any of the hardware. And finally, moving down here to NAPA. So the NAPA low tier, the stop right, you can see there, that's probably actually a little bit better than the OEM GM pad, honestly. And judging by the overall stopping distance of the three pads here, believe it or not, I would probably get the cheap ones from NAPA and just add in the hardware because overall, they seem to be just as good as even the mid and high tier from NAPA as far as stopping power and, you know, their overall condition in this testing. The NAPA high tier is probably, again, about the same. There's really very, very little difference between the NAPA low, mid, and high tier of brake pad. So hopefully that, guys, gives you some insight as to, you know, their overall condition, how well they're going to hold up on your car in a corrosive environment. The thing is with this, guys, all of these pads are remarkably consistent. There wasn't nearly as much variation in this corrosion testing as what there was in the corrosion testing in the first video where I took a look at the aftermarket brands. So take that for what it is. Hopefully that, guys, gives you some insight as to, you know, their overall corrosion resistance. So guys, overall on parts store brake pads, what are my thoughts? Well, what I'm about to say here is going to cost me pretty much any possibility at a sponsorship from AutoZone, Advanced, NAPA, or O'Reilly in the future. So I would appreciate it if you actually, you know, listen up and actually just take a second and listen to what I'm saying, because there's no way any of these companies are going to want to have anything to do with me in the future with what I'm about to tell you. So what you have to understand about the companies featured in this video: Advanced, AutoZone, NAPA, O'Reilly. These companies do not manufacture anything. They simply go to a supplier, buy a product, mark it up, and distribute it to the end user. And really, when you boil that business down to its most basic form, what you're ultimately paying for is convenience, right? Because you can call up one of those parts houses and they will get you brake pads or brake parts today. Like, you will have it today if you need something today. The issue is with brakes, for the average DIYer and the average consumer that does not work in a professional shop, well, brakes, it's no secret that your brakes are going to eventually go bad. So brakes do not just go bad overnight, right? So if brakes don't go bad overnight, why do you need brakes instantaneously if you don't work at a shop? Typically you don't. And what you can do as a consumer is you can go to the exact same suppliers that all of these parts houses are and buy the same brake pads for about a third the amount of money. So for example, O'Reilly and AutoZone, the highest tier O'Reilly and AutoZone pads, those come from Bosch for this application. So I can go to Bosch and I can buy a set of brake pads for this Chevy Cruze for $30 all day long. It's very, very easy to find a set of brake pads for this Chevy Cruze for $30. Well, the issue is with this, if you go to AutoZone or O'Reilly to buy those exact same Bosch pads, those same Bosch pads are gonna cost you $80 to $90. So right off the bat, you can buy 3 sets of pads from Bosch for what you're gonna get 1 set of pads from O'Reilly at $90. And this is how all of these companies are able to give the consumer a lifetime warranty on brake pads, because when you buy 1 set of pads, in reality, you're buying 3 sets of brake pads. And if you know where to go online, it's, like I said, it's very, very easy to find deals on brake pads that are very, very good quality. I have shown them on this series already. So let me bring you over to the bench and just kind of fill you guys in a little bit as far as who is making what here, and what parts stores are getting brake pads from where, because honestly, there's only about 5 different brake pads in this whole test. So these 3 pads, I do not know who is making these 3 pads. These are the kind of the outliers in this test. This is going to be the low-end Brake Best pad, and these are the 2 low-end CarQuest pads. The way that I am able to tell kind of where these pads are coming from and who's making what is, well, first of all, when you buy this many brake pads for 1 application and you start comparing the code structure on all of these pads, well, you can plainly see who is making what and what is coming from where. So these 3 pads are kind of unique in the fact that nothing else in this test matches that code structure. So there's the code on the low-end Brake Best pad. That is going to be the code on the low-end CarQuest pad. That is the metallic pad in this test. And then this is the low-end ceramic from CarQuest. So moving over to AutoZone and O'Reilly, like I was saying, the AutoZone and O'Reilly pads are made by Bosch. And the reason I know that they're made by Bosch is look at the placement of the code and the overall code structure on these brake pads. You can see there, plain as day, that code structure is the exact same as this code structure. And the thing is about this, when I've bought 4 sets of Bosch pads for this vehicle now, and every set of Bosch pads has had that same D01 code on these brake pads, and I believe that is the manufacturer code for Bosch as D01. When you move over to this group of pads, this includes the mid-tier O'Reilly pad, the mid-tier Advanced Auto pad, and the high-tier Advanced Auto pad. All of these are made in India. I believe it says right there by my finger, made in India. So, looking at the code structure, again, you can plainly see the overall code structure on these pads is remarkably similar to one another. And if you actually go back and look at the results of the panic stopping test, these 2 pads right here were the 2 best pads that I have tested so far, and they are remarkably consistent with one another. I think the end result that I got with these 2 pads, the difference between these 2 was about 6 inches. And honestly, my variability in reaction time is going to account for, that 6-inch variance that you're going to see between the stopping distance in those 2 pads. So this is why, guys, it's very, very hard for me to recommend, any single pad on this test, because when you start looking at the pads overall, it's pretty easy to find out, you know what, a lot of these things are the exact same thing. So these pads from AutoZone, this is, I believe the low tier pad is on the bottom, and then the gold tier is on the top. You can see there, the code structure is the same. There appears to be some sort of difference in friction material, being that one is N25 there on the end, and the top one is N24, but they're coming from the exact same factory. I believe they're both made in Mexico, and I find it very hard to believe, again, that 2 different independent, just by happenstance, factories in Mexico have the exact same code structure and code placement on brake pads. So moving over to NAPA. The NAPA pads, I believe, all come from different factories, but what I've able to sort of figure out here is if you look at these NAPA pads, there is a YR code here right at the edge of that pad right there by my thumb. Every one of these pads has that YR at the beginning, and I believe that all 3 of these pads from NAPA are produced by the exact same company. And it's, again, it kind of shows up in their overall performance. The placement on this one is different It's kind of hard to see there, but yeah, right there by my thumb, YR. So when you look at their overall performance, they're all remarkably similar, and it makes sense because, well, they're all coming from the same manufacturer. So now you're able to see why I'm not making any blanket recommendations in this video, because, well, the amount of options you have for brake pads is actually much narrower than you realize when you buy them from a parts store. So why not cut out a bunch of markup and save yourself a bunch of money and just go right to the source to get those brake pads? So with all that in mind, guys, I will have links down in the description to the Bosch pads, to the Wagner pads, to the Power Stop pads, and to any brake tools that you would need to do, you know, if you're doing a frequent number of brake jobs, to some common brake tools that you guys may want to look into, in addition to a link to Tommy Callahan's favorite hoodie. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.